Vanishing Folklore and Beliefs.
The Waterknick from Czech Folk Tales. Public domain reading. The Waterknick, circa 1917. Once there were two children, a boy and a girl. They only had a mother who was a poor widow. One day their mother sent them to get some wood for the fire, and off they went. The girl was just learning to knit, so she put a ball of wool in her pocket. They went on as far as they knew the way. Then suddenly they began to wander, and then they began to wonder whether they could find their way home again. The girl said, "Do not worry. I will bind the end of the thread to a tree, and so we shall be able to find our way back." So they went on confidently till the thread had all but run out. They then turned back, but alas, they found that wild creatures of the forest had broken the thread. What were they now to do? They wandered and wandered till night fell, and they then saw that they would have to spend the night in the forest. Soon they came to a mysterious pond. This pond was the home of an evil creature known as the Waterknick. The Waterknick lived with an evil hag at the bottom of the pond. The children found that they could not go any further, so they walked around the pond until the Waterknick got a hold of them. He then took them with him and enslaved them. When the Waterknick got home with him, his wife, the hag, was waiting for him. Around the stove there were some shelves for vessels. These strange cups were used for catching poor souls. The Waterknick and his evil wife were delighted with the children. They decided that they would employ them as servants. So Mrs. Waterknick took charge of them. The children then spent years and years this way. They had to learn about everything under the water. The Waterknick and his wife fed them only flowers of the forest. One day the Waterknick went away to catch some human souls, and he gave orders to Mrs. Waterknick not to leave the children alone. But the old hag soon fell asleep, and the children walked some distance from the hut till they thought she would scold them, and so they quickly returned home. But they meant to go further each day, if only the old hag went to sleep again. As soon as they were sure that she was asleep, they ran out of the hut again and went as far as they could. However, the old hag soon woke up and screeched, "Where are you, children? Where are you?" She jumped to her feet and ran after them, her long talons scraping the floor. They were within a few steps of getting safely away when, alas, the evil hag overtook them. She took them back and forced them to work. When the Waterknick came home, she told him all about what happened, and the Waterknick said, "Never mind. I'll set them to work and they won't have time to think about making their way home." So in the morning he took them to the forest and gave them a flimsy wooden hatchet and a flimsy wooden saw, and bade them to fell all the trees. And he said, "When these trees are all cut down, you shall go back again and again and again." So the Waterknick left them, and the children began the work. They took the flimsy saw and tried to cut down a tree, but the saw soon broke, and they were in despair. They then took the flimsy hatchet and the hatchet split in two after just one stroke. They then began to cry. "Things look bad for us," they said. Since they saw that they could not help themselves, they stayed where they were, and presently they fell asleep. The Waterknick then came and said, "Have you finished?" They told him that the hatchet and the saw were only made of wood, and that both were now broken. He angrily took them home. The next day the Waterknick went about his work while Mrs. Waterknick was busy outside the hut. The children looked at the odd cups on the shelves, not knowing quite what they were. The cups were tilted up, so the girl lifted one of them. As soon as she did this, she heard some heavenly words which said, "God speed you." She then lifted another cup and another cup and another cup, and each time the same greeting came again, "God speed you." The poor human souls that had been imprisoned under those cups for millennia were now released and free. The horrible hag came rushing into the room to try to stop them, and she saw that all the cups had been lifted. She began to curse and to yell, and she said that the children would certainly get a good thrashing when the Waterknick came home and saw what they had done. The children often felt lonely in the years to follow. They thought of their poor mother and wondered if she were still alive. They wondered how they could get away. They were despondent. But they decided that the next day they had to escape. So while the hag was sleeping, they would try to see how far they could get. "If only we could get as far as home, it would all be all right." In the morning, the girl had to comb Mrs. Waterknick's hair and dress her smartly. When they had finished, Mrs. Waterknick had a sleep. Now was the chance, and the children took to their heels. They were as quick as ravens, trying to get away before Mrs. Waterknick should wake. Being swift of foot and desperate, they finally reached the shore. They leapt out and ran straight on again, of course. They could hear the hag screeching behind them in pursuit, but they were now safe on dry land. They finally thought, "Oh, we needn't care for anything now." They could hear the hag in the water yelling at them. But the hag soon stopped her pursuit. The children were utterly exhausted, so they lay down under a tree in the forest and fell asleep. As they were sleeping, somebody woke them. It was a forester. They told him that they were afraid of falling into the Waterknick's hands again. But the forester told them not to be afraid, and asked how they came there. The children told him everything just as it had happened. Now the forester remembered that he had heard of a widow who had lost her children, so he thought that these must be those very children. He said nothing, but he told his wife to get them some food, for the children were emaciated. He asked the children to sit down and eat. The children, overwhelmed by the food, thought it was so nice, and he asked them what they were accustomed to eating. They said that the Waterknick and his wife only fed them flowers from the forest. He told them to eat plenty. The forester then decided to do all he could to get the children home. At last it was discovered where their mother lived, and so the children came back to her. Overjoyed, they lived with their mother until they all died of old age. If you enjoyed this reading, take a moment to press the subscribe button. Thank you very much for listening.
Vanishing Folklore and Beliefs.